My name is Jackson. I'm 28, and I grew up with a love for the outdoors. Living in California, trips to places like Redwood National Park were second nature to me. This past summer, a few friends and I decided to spend a weekend camping deep in the Redwood Forest. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. Just me, Chris, Tommy, and Jay. But after that trip, I'll never step foot in those woods again. It was a hot Friday when we reached the spot we picked out. Tall trees surrounded us, their branches reaching so high they nearly touched the clouds. It felt like we were cut off from the rest of the world. After setting up camp, we made a fire and spent the night drinking and laughing, telling old stories. The air was cool, and the distant sound of animals made the night feel peaceful. Saturday morning, we decided to explore deeper into the forest. We walked for hours until we stumbled upon something strange. An old, worn-out tent. It didn't fit in with the serene beauty of the forest. The fabric was ripped in places, stained with what looked like mud, and one side had caved in completely. It felt out of place, almost wrong. Who would just leave this here? Tommy asked, looking around as if expecting the owner to show up. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check inside. There was a strong smell, something rotten. As we lifted the torn flap, we found rotting food scattered across the ground, moldy bread, old cans, and what looked like spoiled meat. In the corner was a backpack covered in dust and dirt. I opened it, feeling a little uneasy. Inside, I found clothes, a wallet with a driver's license that had faded beyond recognition, and a journal. The journal's last few pages were smeared with something dark, but I could make out the last sentence. He watches us at night. We're never alone. It sent a chill down my spine. I looked at Chris, who was reading over my shoulder. His face turned pale. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. The rest of the day, no one spoke much. We headed back to camp. But the mood had shifted. Something about that tent unsettled us all. That night, sitting around the campfire, the silence felt heavy. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. The firelight barely cut through the darkness around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Sometime after midnight, we heard it, a soft rustling coming from the trees. At first, we brushed it off as the wind or an animal, but the sound got louder. Chris stood up. "I'll go check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. He was always the brave one, never afraid of anything. I watched as he disappeared into the trees, the beam of his flashlight flickering between the trunks. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. "Chris," Tommy called out, but there was no response. The rustling had stopped, but now there was an eerie silence, a silence that felt like the forest was holding its breath. "Something's wrong," I said, standing up. My heart pounded in my chest, and the fire crackled behind me as we all stared into the darkness. Tommy and I grabbed flashlights and followed the path Chris had taken. We searched for what felt like hours, calling out his name, but there was nothing, just more trees and more silence. Jay stayed back at camp, keeping the fire going, hoping Chris would just come walking out of the woods, laughing about how he'd scared us. But Chris never came back. We searched until dawn, and when the first light broke through the trees, that's when we found him. Or what was left of him. Chris's body was mutilated. His face was barely recognizable, his chest torn open as if something had ripped into him. His body had been dragged deep into the woods, far from the camp. Blood stained the earth around him, and the sight made me feel sick to my stomach. Tommy collapsed beside me, shaking. We knew we had to leave. By the time we got back to camp, Jay had already packed up everything. He took one look at our faces and knew. We didn't say a word to each other as we hiked back to the car. When we reached the nearest ranger station, we reported everything. The authorities went out there, but they never found anything. No tracks, no signs of what or who could have done that to Chris. It was like the forest had swallowed everything whole, leaving no trace behind. The three of us made a pact that day. We'd never talk about the trip again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear the sound of rustling leaves, and it feels like something's watching me, something that never left those woods. My name is Luke. I'm 34, and I'm an experienced solo hiker. I've spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, from deserts to mountains, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in Glacier National Park last summer. I had planned a 3-day hike through the park, choosing a more secluded trail to avoid the crowds. I wasn't looking for a social experience. I wanted peace and solitude, just me and nature. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a stream running nearby. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I liked it that way. On my second night, I sat by my campfire, staring up at the stars, listening to the crackling of the flames. The day had been uneventful, just hiking, admiring the views, and enjoying the solitude. As I lay in my sleeping bag later, I started hearing rustling outside the tent. At first, I brushed it off as some small animal moving through the brush, maybe a raccoon or deer. I wasn't worried, but then the rustling grew louder, and I could hear soft footsteps circling the tent. My heart started to race. The sounds weren't like those of a harmless animal anymore. It was too deliberate, too slow, like someone was trying not to be noticed. I sat up, straining to hear, but the noises stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, and forced myself to lie back down. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of my tent zipper slowly being pulled open. I froze in place, gripping my sleeping bag so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The zipper moved so slowly, inch by inch, and I could see the flap of the tent start to part. My breath caught in my throat, and I prayed that whatever it was would just leave me alone. The tent flap opened, and standing there, illuminated by the moonlight, was a figure. But something was horribly wrong. It wasn't a person, at least not like anyone I had ever seen. The figure was tall and thin, almost emaciated, but what struck me most was that it had no face. Its skin was pale and smooth, like a blank canvas, with no eyes, no nose, no mouth, nothing. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure just stood there, peering inside, its head slightly tilted as if studying me. Seconds felt like hours as it remained motionless. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, just as slowly as it had arrived, the figure backed away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the tent. I lay there, trembling, unable to comprehend what I had just seen. I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the faceless figure to reappear. I didn't stop hiking until I reached the nearest ranger station later that afternoon. I must have looked like a mess when I walked in. The ranger asked if I was okay, and I told him what had happened. I didn't expect him to believe me, but I had to tell someone. He listened quietly, his expression serious. When I finished, he leaned in and said, "You're not the first person to report something like this." My stomach dropped. The ranger went on to explain that there had been a series of strange sightings in the area recently. But what chilled me the most was when he mentioned a recent prison escape. A man convicted of multiple brutal murders, known for mutilating his victims' faces, had escaped from a nearby facility just a week before. No one's seen him since, the ranger said. But your description, well, let's just say it fits with some of the reports we've gotten. I left the station as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figure. Was it him? Had I narrowly escaped a serial killer? Or was it something else entirely, something not human? I didn't want to know. I haven't been back to Glacier National Park since that trip, and I doubt I ever will. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about that night. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the zipper of my tent is moving again, that the faceless figure is standing there, waiting for me in the dark. Some nights, I can still hear the soft footsteps circling my bed, just like they circled my tent in the woods. And every time, I lie there, paralyzed with fear, praying that whatever it is will just disappear into the shadows once more. We'd planned the camping trip to Banff National Park for weeks. Ben, me, and our two other friends, Kyle and Sean, needed to get away from the stress of our daily lives. The idea of spending a few days by the lake, surrounded by trees, breathing in that fresh mountain air, seemed like the perfect escape. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sky already hinting at an incoming storm. Despite the warning signs, we pitched our tents by the lake, too stubborn to change our plans. The scenery was stunning. Tall pines surrounding the crystal-clear lake, the mountains standing tall in the distance. We were the only people there. For a moment, it felt like we had the entire wilderness to ourselves. By the time night fell, the storm had fully rolled in. The wind whipped around us, and heavy raindrops began to fall. We huddled around the small fire we managed to keep alive, talking about nothing in particular, just trying to enjoy the moment. But the rain kept pouring down harder, forcing us to retreat into our tents. I remember lying on my back, listening to the wind howling through the trees, the rain pounding against the tent's fabric. Thunder cracked overhead, lighting up the sky for brief seconds at a time. It was unsettling, but we were safe, or at least we thought we were. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, but growing louder. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but then I heard Kyle whisper, "Do you hear that?" I sat up quickly, my heart racing. It wasn't just the rain anymore. There was someone outside. Ben, who was in the tent next to mine, unzipped the door just slightly and peeked out. "Probably just another camper caught in the storm," he muttered, trying to keep calm. But something didn't sit right with any of us. There was no light, no other sounds, just those heavy footsteps splashing through the mud. Ben unzipped the tent all the way and shone his flashlight out into the night. At first, nothing, just rain and the darkness. But then we saw him. A man, soaking wet, standing only a few feet away, staring straight at us. His clothes were drenched, clinging to his body, his hair matted down by the rain. His face was blank, expressionless. He just stood there, watching us. "Hey, man, you okay?" Ben called out, trying to be friendly. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. He didn't blink. The rain continued to pour down, but he just stood there like a statue. We offered him food, a seat by the fire, even space in our tents, but he didn't speak. His eyes just followed us, unnerving and empty. There was something off about him, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We waited for what felt like hours, sitting in awkward silence as this stranger watched us. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and one by one, we drifted off to sleep. It wasn't a peaceful sleep, though. I kept waking up, heart pounding, checking the tent flap to make sure he was gone. By the time morning came, we were all relieved to see the stranger had disappeared. But the relief didn't last long. Near our tents, carved deep into the trunk of a tall pine tree, was a message: "You should have let me in." The words were rough, almost like they had been gouged out with a knife. The sight of them made my stomach churn. None of us knew what to say. We packed up our things quickly, no one wanting to stay there another minute longer. We left the campsite that day and tried to put the encounter behind us, chalking it up to some strange drifter, maybe someone struggling with their own demons. But days later, a news report caught our attention. A man's body had been found near the lake we camped by. He'd been dead for at least a week, the authorities said. They showed a picture of him, soaked clothes, matted hair, the same blank expression. It was him. There was no doubt in my mind. The weirdest part was his face. The authorities said they found him with a grin, a twisted smile that didn't belong on a dead man's face. Every night since then, I've had trouble sleeping. I keep hearing those footsteps in the rain, feeling like someone's watching me. I can't shake the feeling that we should have let him in. Maybe he's still waiting.